everybody. I am Terry Wally. I am co-president of the ERA NC Alliance, and I'm so excited that so many folks could be here today to join us for what's going to be a really enlightening hour. To set everything up for us, I just want you to know that we talked about this at our annual meeting, and what we have determined is that we have currently done everything we can do on the federal ERA, whether that's the courts or the Congress or through the executive branch. So a year ago, we decided to turn our attention to what we could do in the state of North Carolina. We have filed multiple ratification bills. We have worked with the Statutes Commission, and we have also started laying the groundwork for a state ERA for our state constitution. So the one thing that we have, discovered this past week in Pennsylvania is that an ERA, whether it's a state ERA or a federal ERA, is going to have an impact that can be harnessed for use in abortion access. So it's going to be, so the ERA is an important tool on a lot of levels, but that's the most recent. I'll be sending out an email later today to kind of catch you up on the Pennsylvania situation. So what we found is that we really can't move forward now with the NCGA that we've got, or even the congressional delegation that we've got. And we have, anti-ERA legislators in both. So what we want to do, our goal for this year is to change that. We're going to make 2024 all about changing the NCGA and changing our congressional delegation to a fully pro-ERA delegation and legislature. So first things first, what do we need to do about that? Well, the first thing that we need is we need a solid understanding of North Carolina and North Carolina voting patterns. And then once we really understand that, we can use that to affect change in this state. And so today we have a special guest, Michael Bitzer, and he is going to give us those hard facts. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Bitzer. Michael Bitzer holds the Leonard Chair of Political Science at Catawba College, where he has been a professor of politics and history since 2002. He's the author of Redistricting and Gerrymandering in North Carolina, Battlelines in the Tar Heel State, and of several book chapters on North Carolina politics. He will also serve as the founding director of a new center on North Carolina politics and public service at Catawba starting in 2025. He's a frequent analyst for various media outlets, including CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, BBC, London Broadcast Corporation, Australian Broadcast Corporation, France 24, Al Jazeera, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Charlotte Observer, the Los Angeles Times. The list goes on and on. I think I first heard you on Charlotte Talks on our local NPR station. In 2012, he was named the Swink Professor for Excellence in Teaching at Catawba and has been a visiting professor at Davidson College. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Bitzer, and I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Terry, and everybody who helped make this session possible. I'm going to share a slide presentation that I think will kind of illustrate a couple of key points that I want to make in terms of thinking about North Carolina politics. And hopefully help you to better understand this state. I know a lot of folks within this organization are very active in North Carolina politics. And so what I want to do is kind of share with you how I see North Carolina politics in its current dynamics. And I think it's important in terms of three key points that I'll share to kind of realize where we are as a state, where some trend lines have been moving. And importantly, as I tell my U.S. campaigns and elections classes, typically every election, there is something unique about it. And the voters will always throw us a curveball. But the trends tend to be kind of locked in because of some dynamics I'll talk about in just a minute. So I hope that what this will do is kind of ground you in terms of how I see North Carolina politics, and whatever insights, analysis you take away from it, I hope this helps you better understand this state. So to kind of start here, three key points that I want to make this morning, and I will save some time at the end for questions and possible answers in that regard. But the first is I want to talk a little bit about the consistent voter behavior that we have seen in our polarized politics. This is not just a North Carolina phenomenon, it is a national phenomenon. And I think North Carolina is really a case study. It's almost a microcosm of so many dynamics we see at the national level playing out here in North Carolina. I think that there's within this polarization a geographic polarization that is important to understand here in North Carolina, and I'll talk about that. And then I'll wrap up with some data about a generational polarization that I'm just starting to get into in terms of the research, but some of the early trend lines point to some distinct dynamics at play in this state that I think is helpful to better understand the state as a whole. So kind of first starting off talking about the issue of polarization in terms of thinking about the national dynamics, which I think play out nicely here in North Carolina. We as political scientists rely on a massive survey that is done every presidential year called the American National Elections Study. And I want to show the 2016 and the 2020 dynamics related to how people identify based on their partisanship, how they see the strength of that partisanship, and then ultimately their presidential vote choice. And so typically the survey will ask the respondents, well, how do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent? And then typically the follow-up question is, well, if you are a partisan, what is the strength of your partisanship? Are you a strong, diehard, purely loyal partisan? Or are you somebody who's not a foam at the mouth, rabid kind of partisan? If you identify as an independent, to which political party do you typically lean to, one way or the other? And in 2016, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, everything from strong Democrat to pure independent to strong Republican. The percentages underneath show the national electorate. So less than 10%, if you look in the middle column, the pure independents, less than 10% of the electorate was a pure independent. Everybody else identified or leaned to a political party or the other. And how these folks voted, well, among the strong partisans, not surprisingly, 95 to 97% of them voted for their presidential party nominee. When you get into the not strong partisans, those tend to drop to about 3/4. You see some defections. Among not strong Democrats, 17% of them voted for Donald Trump. Among not strong Republicans, 16% voted for Hillary Clinton. When you get into the independents, the independent Democrats and the independent Republicans, they tend to be marginally more partisan than those that identify with a political party. When you get into the independents, that's where you see the real division within party voting choices. And in particularly, you see the strength of third-party votes. Now, in 2016, that election was pretty much known as the choices were limited. Democrats, Republicans, both were not thrilled with their presidential party nominees. And so the third-party votes tended to be much higher than what we have seen in the past. If you compare this to the 2020, same dynamics, same kind of responses. Among the partisans, even more so, above 95% voting for their party. Among the not very strong partisans, Democrats were well over 90%, but you saw 20% of not strong Republicans voting for Joe Biden. This, I believe, was the anti-Trump factor within the electorate. Same dynamic played among the independent-leaning partisans. 94% of independent Democrats were voting for Joe Biden, but 15% of independent Republicans broke ranks and voted for Joe Biden. When you get again into the independents, again, less than 10%, the majority of them voted for Joe Biden. You saw the drop in terms of votes for third-party candidates, particularly among independents. So that's kind of a setup of the national dynamics that I think is applicable to North Carolina as well. In thinking about North Carolina, there's been a lot of commentary. How much of a battleground state are we? Are we truly competitive, or are we something else? And I think if you look at the 2008 to 2022 statewide races, and I break these down by the federal races, presidential and U.S. Senate contest, versus the Council of State contest, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, all of the statewide executive offices that we elect. If you combine all the votes for Republicans and Democrats from 2008 to 2022, at the federal level, we are a 49.5 Republican state to a 47.7 Democratic state. But if you take just the two-party vote, we are a 51-49 at the federal level. At the Council of State level, we are a 50.9 Democratic to 48.7 Republican. Again, two-party vote, 51 to 49. And so we have had this history of being basically bipolar in our politics. This goes back to the 1970s and particularly into the 1980s, when North Carolina would vote Republican for president and Democratic for the governorship on the same ballot. The difference between pre-2008 and post-2008 is this intense competitiveness, this 51-49 state that we are truly in. If you take then that as kind of a basis for thinking about North Carolina politics, I think what you can also do is see a consistency within this voting pattern. And one thing that I've done is taken the county level performance, in this regard, the Republican presidential vote percentage in each of the 100 counties in North Carolina. And I asked the question, how much could the 2016 Republican presidential vote give me insight into what happened in 2020? And so the thinking was, as the Republican vote percentage in a county increased in 2016, would it do the same thing in 2020? Meaning, how close is the relationship between these two vote patterns? And if you look at each of the 100 counties and note the number there in the top, 0.98, what that is telling me as a political scientist is that 98% of a North Carolina county's 2020 Republican presidential vote can be explained by the 2016 Republican presidential vote. This tells me we are generally consistent. We have calcified, as some political scientists have noted, at the national level. And so we have a fairly consistent vote pattern when it comes to previous elections and subsequent elections. And to give you another sense of this dynamic, taking the 2020, what I call big three election results, so U.S. President, the U.S. Senate race, and the North Carolina governor's race, combining all of those into the counties, and then looking at the 2022 election for U.S. Senate, the Ted Budd campaign in particularly, you will see again a very close relationship to how votes were cast in 2020's Big Three and how they were cast for Republican Ted Budd for the U.S. Senate in 2022. You can do this with a whole host of down-the-ballot races, taking the congressional districts in 2022, seeing how they paired up with the Big Three in 2020, 99% explanation with the various congressional districts. You can even go down to the state legislative level. In the state Senate, looking at the two-party vote percentages, the 2020 numbers compared to 2022 Republican candidates in all of the state Senate districts. Again, a fairly strong relationship between the two. Same thing for the state house. Looking at the 2020 Big Three in each House district compared to how the Republicans did in those same districts in 2022, again, a strong relationship. So what this is telling me is there's some consistency in terms of looking to the past and trying to analyze where things might be going and what actually tends to happen. And so in thinking about that, I want to kind of give you the big picture here when it comes to both the congressional and the state legislative districts. And this is the new congressional map that the Republicans passed last year that will be, we believe, in effect for November's general election. This is a significant change from what we have currently to what we will potentially see. And I want to go around the state, starting with the 3rd congressional district down east along the coast, work my way kind of clockwise around to the 1st and give you a sense of what are the metrics when we use the 2020 Big Three elections combined with the 2022 Senate elections. In the 3rd congressional district, that's a Republican 55% district. Now, for political scientists, what we generally tend to classify as competitive is anywhere from 45 to 55. Anything 55 to 60 tends to be a likely district for one party over the other. Anything over 60%, that is a solid partisan district. And you'll see this play out as I move through the districts. Moving to the 7th congressional district, they're based in New Hanover and Brunswick County, Republican 57%. Going up to the 9th district, starting in Alamance, going down to Hoke and Cumberland County, a 56% Republican district. The new 8th, which is an open seat district, Republican 59. If you look at the 12th congressional district, centered in Mecklenburg County and taking in most of the city of Charlotte, that is a Democratic 75% district. The new 14th, an open seat district, that is a Republican 57. To the west, into the mountains, the 11th, a Republican 54. Also in the mountains, the 5th, a 57 Republican district. Moving into the 10th, a open seat election because of Patrick McHenry's retirement, a Republican 58. Moving into the 6th, a new open district, Republican 57. Moving into the 4th, there in Orange and Durham County and the southwest corner of Wake and parts of Chatham County, a Democratic 74. Along with the 2nd, there centralized in Wake, a Democratic 68 district. And then the 13th congressional district, kind of the Crescent district, starting in Caswell and looping around south to the Harnett and Lee County, Republican 58. So most of these districts are solidly or likely for one party over the other. North Carolina's lone competitive district, the 1st, and that's a Democratic 51. That's basically a toss-up in my mind. Depending on who shows up in terms of voters, this could go either way in this particular election. So that's kind of the big picture when it comes to the U.S. House. When it comes to the state Senate, the new maps for the state Senate, I divide them up into the 6 categories, going from strong Republican to competitive but lean Republican, competitive but lean Democratic, over to strong Democratic. And among the districts in the state Senate, you'll see it broken down to where the supermajority is needed at 30 seats. If Republicans win all of the matrix predicted districts assigned to them, they would have the 30 seats needed for a supermajority. If you go to the North Carolina State House and do the same kind of analysis using the same metrics, you'll see it again distributed among the various categories For the state house, supermajority 72, they would fall one district short if they win everything in their Republican-oriented districts. They would need to pick up at least one Democratic district to make that supermajority. And so that, to me, is kind of the consistent voter behavior in our polarized politics. Next, I want to turn to geography. And I think that this is another important dynamic we see nationally, but it's playing out here in North Carolina as well. We use the terms urban, suburban, and rural, and kind of not really sure. We know it when we see it kind of thing, but I use the definition from the Federal Office of Management and Budget. And what they do is they classify a central city within an urban county, and then the counties surrounding that urban county that interact with the various urban counties, that falls into a metropolitan statistical area. And so here in this map, I've identified the urban counties, the suburban counties. Anything not within a metropolitan statistical area falls into a rural category. But I think when you have to think about urban counties, you really have to think about two distinct regions within that urban county. And I'm taking Mecklenburg here as just an example. Of course, the city of Charlotte is dominant within Mecklenburg County, but if you get outside the city limits, you've got areas like Huntersville, Cornelius, Davidson in the northern part of Mecklenburg. In the southern part, Pineville, Matthews, Mint Hill, Stallings. Those areas are very different in terms of their voting patterns compared to the city of Charlotte. And so what I do is I actually break North Carolina up into 4 regions, not just 3, but 4. The central cities, those urban suburbs, the surrounding suburban counties, and rural counties. And then taking the North Carolina Big 3 two-party votes for each of those regions in the state as a whole, again, a competitive state, 52-48 in 2016, 51-49 in 2020. But look at the central cities. In 2016, they went 2-1 Democratic, and in 2020, they went 70-30 Democratic. It's in the urban suburbs that you see the most competitive region of North Carolina's politics. In 2016, they were dead even, 50-50. If you take them in the 2020, they went slightly more Republican, but still within that competitive band that we as political scientists tend to think about. The surrounding suburban counties are indeed the most Republican areas of the state, basically 63-65% Republican. The rural counties in the past 2 presidential elections have been fairly consistent at 60-40. Everybody talks about the rural realignment to the Republicans in this state, but there is healthy Black percentages of voters in many rural areas that make it slightly more Democratic than what you see in the surrounding suburban counties. Do the same analysis for 2022's U.S. Senate elections, and again, the pattern is fairly consistent. A 52-48 state, but in the central cities, 70-30 Democratic. The urban suburbs, again, slightly more Republican, but still within that band of competitiveness. The surrounding suburban counties and the rural counties went slightly more Republican as well. So this pattern in terms of geography really tells me that for a competitive state, for the most part, we are very polarized. It's when you pull it all together that you get the competitive dynamics. And we kind of see that in the precinct level returns. You can tell where the deep blue pockets of urbanization in the central cities are. Up in the northeast corner, those dark blue counties, those are majority minority counties, high percentage of Black voters. But if you take all of those precincts and again classify them by the way that they are voting in terms of their patterns. So using at the bottom of the screen, Republican greater than 60% classified in dark red, over to Republican 50 to 54%, light red, light blue, Democratic 50 to 54, very dark blue, a precinct voted Democratic 60% or more. Now, for a social scientist, we would think if we classified all of these precincts, we should get as a competitive state, a nice kind of bell curve dynamic, big in the middle, small on the extremes. But here's how it actually played out in 2016, classifying each precinct by one of those 6 categories. The strong Republican precincts, 45% of the state's 2,600 precincts. The strong Democratic, 28%. If you combine those two, over 7 out of 10 precincts went overwhelmingly for one party over the other. In 2020, the same dynamic, 70% of North Carolina precincts went overwhelmingly for one party. If you look in the middle, 13% in 2016 and 14% in 2020, less than 15% of the precincts in North Carolina are competitive. That tells me we as North Carolinians have sorted ourselves. We are living in like-minded communities, and we vote based on who our neighbors are in general. If you break it down by those 4 categories, I think this makes it even more stark in terms of the reality. For the central cities in 2016, 2/3 of all the precincts in central cities went Democratic 60% or greater. In 2020, that number went up to 3/4, 75%. Compare that to rural counties. We talk about the urban-rural divide. I show this to my class, and I say, this is the most stark example I can give of this urban-rural divide. Rural counties, 60% strong Republican in 2016, dipped slightly, but still 58% of all the rural precincts went heavily Republican in 2020. When you look at the suburbs, those urban suburbs, they tend to mirror the state dynamics. A little more balanced, a little more competitive in the middle between 2016 and 2020. But when you cross the county line into one of those surrounding suburban counties, it is again evident that those are indeed the most Republican areas based on votes and based on performance in comparison to everything else. In terms of the 2022 U.S. Senate, the most recent statewide major election, the state, again, 72%. I feel like I'm a broken record, but I think it's helpful to have repeat because that's the way you learn about it, finally. 72% of North Carolina precincts went overwhelmingly. The central cities, again, over 70% strong Democratic. Urban suburbs, more like the state dynamics, but slightly more Republican. The surrounding suburban counties and the rural counties, overwhelmingly Republican. So that's kind of the geographic polarization. The last area that I wanted to talk about is a research interest that I've gotten very much into in the past few years, and that's the generational polarization that we're seeing play out. If you look within the most recent, at the beginning of the year, party registration, the 7.5 million registered voters in North Carolina, and break it down by the 3 major categories. The rise of the unaffiliated is indeed the story of North Carolina politics. We are seeing continuous rise of unaffiliated voters over registering as partisans. But this has a generational dynamic at play. Starting with the oldest generation, the greatest and the silent generation, that's about 6% of the voter pool. They are indeed very much partisan. They're almost equally divided between Republicans and Democrats. Unaffiliated's 23%, less than a quarter. You get into boomers. Again, this group tends to be much more partisan in their registration. When you get into Gen X, however, kind of middle-aged voters right now, they tend to be the natural bridge between older and younger voters. Slight more plurality, kind of mirroring the state average at 36% unaffiliated. But when you get into millennials, those voters that are currently 27 to 44 years old, 43% are registered unaffiliated, and the youngest voters, those voters coming into the electorate, age 18 to 25, 26, nearly 50% of them are registering as unaffiliated. As I tell my students, are y'all giving the parties the middle finger? Because it looks like it from this particular graph. They don't like either political party, but they don't like the label, I think. When it comes to their voting patterns, and I'll show this in just a minute, there's a very distinct partisan dynamic at play. And so this rise of the unaffiliated is being driven oftentimes by younger voters. And this is something we in North Carolina politics are following very closely. There's 3 other distinguished colleagues of mine in the state. We're all very interested in this dynamic. We're trying to understand it. This is a research area that we're going to be following very closely. When you think about these generational voting patterns and the party identification, I think you will see something unique. The Pew Research Center has done a lot of analysis on generational politics, and they have asked over a series of time, what is your party identification? And then how do you lean to one party over the other? The silent generation kind of nicely breaks again into those partisan categories. Only a quarter of them identify as independents. But if you push those independents, they're fairly evenly split between the two parties. Boomers, same kind of dynamic, more partisan, but the increase in the unaffiliated or independent at 30%. But push those independents, they generally tend to fall into one party or the other. Gen X, same dynamic, but notice that independents now 35%. They also split nicely between the two political parties. It is indeed millennials that have the largest plurality of identification with political independence, but they are not like their older brethren. They are indeed a wide gap when it comes to partisan identification. 54% Democratic to 38% Republican. This could portend a huge shift in how all of these generations that typically are close, we could see a partisan gap of significant value moving forward. So in thinking about North Carolina's politics, again, kind of thinking about the national dynamics, how voter registration is playing out, I asked the question, if you increase a voter precinct electorate by older voters, so as the percentage in a voter precinct increases among the greatest and silent generation, what happens to the Republican vote? Does it go up, as we would suspect? And indeed, it does. It's a weak relationship, but there is an indication that as older voters are more in a precinct's electorate, that precinct will tend to go more Republican. Same dynamic when it comes to boomers. A much stronger relationship, but again, not anywhere near the 98% that we've seen. But this shows me that if you increase the number of boomers voting, that increases the Republican vote share. Gen X, not as great of a slope as boomers were, but again, a more positive relationship towards Republicans. What happens among millennials? Knowing the patterns that we have seen so far, what happens when you increase millennial voters in a precinct compared to the Republican vote share? Significantly down, meaning that millennials are not voting Republican if you increase their numbers in a precinct. For the newest voters coming in, the same dynamic at play. This was 2020's numbers. Here's the 2022 U.S. Senate dynamics. Again, for boomers, an increase as more boomers are in the electorate. The Republican vote share went up for U.S. Senate. Same thing with Gen X. For millennials, going down. And among Gen Z, going down as well. So we know some vote patterns dynamics. The key thing, and we will say this ad nauseum until November, is it's all about who shows up. Where is the turnout? And looking at turnout based on generational dynamics, in North Carolina in 2020, we hit 75%, a record for us in the modern era. But if you break it down by generational cohorts, Gen Z only had a 61% turnout rate, millennials 62%, Gen X close to the state average, boomers at 86%, the greatest silent generation at 79%. So we have the tale of two different cohorts not showing up versus overperforming and showing up at greater levels. Take the 2022 general election for U.S. Senate, the statewide turnout rate 51%. For Gen Z, it was only 24%. Millennials, a little over a third. Gen X at 55%. Boomers at 71%. The greatest at 2/3. So I think when you see and talk about the dynamics at play, there is a generational dynamic at work. We know what the patterns are for voting. We also know what the patterns are for turnout rates. So just to kind of recap, consistent voting pattern. I think this is with us for some time because our polarized politics will be with us for some time. There's indeed geographic polarization at play and also a generational dynamic that we as political scientists will be watching very closely. So with that, I hope I've left enough time for questions and, as I like to say, possible answers.
Dr. Bitzer, that was fantastic. We have got our work cut out for us, y'all. I've got to say, it's look, but I think we can do it. I really think we can do it. I'm going to go ahead and start with the questions. We've asked everybody to put their questions in the chat, but I'm going to ask you one out loud. We have seen, we are seeing a huge population growth, right?
Mm-hmm.
People moving in from New York, New Jersey, all over the nation. When you talk about geographic polarization, what happens to those people who move in?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that that is one of a new kind of research agenda that I and my colleagues need to be thinking about much more. In general, what we know about the South in general is that first, North Carolina is what's considered a growth state. So that includes North Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, and Texas. These are all growth states. And in general, what the research has found is those growth states are moving more and more competitive. The stagnant southern states, states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, they are moving more Republican. So the influx, the in-migration of voters into these growth states is having a real impact. And one of the great aspects to North Carolina's voter registration data is that they ask voters, can you tell us where you were born? Now, it may not tell us necessarily where they're coming from, but we know at least their birth state. And indeed, we have a huge number of people coming into this state and probably will continue to have that in-migration vote patterns. But what some of the early research on in-migration shows us is that they are very different from the natives of a state. And the in-migrants tend to be more Democratic in leaning, and the natives tend to be more Republican in leaning. I think North Carolina, again, presents a fascinating case study. It's one of the questions that's been burning in the back of my mind if I can just find the time to kind of analyze the data amongst everything else that I'm kind of found myself in. But I think that there is some real distinctiveness to who is moving in, and in particularly what region of the country are they moving in from? Are they moving in from the Northeast, the Midwest, the West? Are they coming from other Southern states? And I think one of the things that we'll be seeing is kind of closely related to that. We have sorted ourselves. People are moving to communities that they feel comfortable with, and that comfort level is oftentimes associated with political comfort. And so the relationship, I think, is there between the types of communities folks move into, where they're seeking to create their new home, and how the political dynamic plays out. I mean, when I first ran those polarization of precinct categories, I had to do 3 or 4 checks just to make sure I had coded things correctly, because thinking about 70% of the state's precincts voting for one party over the other is just a huge dynamic at play. And I think that that has ramifications throughout a whole host of things. I'm sorry I can't give you a more definitive answer about the folks coming into the state. Invite me back probably in a couple of months or maybe a year, and I'll have some time to get into that and really kind of figure out the patterns and the trends in that.
Well, we're certainly going to invite you back. That is for sure. Virginia, I know we've got a lot of questions in the chat. Do you want to throw any of them out there for Dr. Bitzer?
Sure. The first one that came in right before you started speaking, and wonders whether you believe that a great turnout can defeat a bad gerrymander.
That's a great question. I think in those districts that I kind of classified as competitive, but lean to one party over the other, I think turnout does matter. And I think it is a fundamental component. When you get into those districts that are 55 to 60 or even 60 and above, that's going to take a tsunami, particularly for the 60 or above. That is a tidal wave of epic proportions to even make a dent into those kinds of districts, because the voters have become so consistent, so calcified in that regard. But I think the focus is should be on those competitive but lean to one party over the other. If you are on one side of the political aisle, you want to make sure that your competitive but lean to your party districts are buffered, are reinforced. For the districts that are in the competitive but lean to the opposition party, that's where you want to try and drive the voter turnout if I was a strategist. So I think, you know, we talk about the game of politics, and I use that analogy with my students. And one aspect to playing a game is you got to know where the field is. You got to know what court you're playing on. You got to know where the pitch is. Well, the pitch, the field, the courts are these competitive districts. But if you're going to go play in somebody else's sandbox and their sandbox is overwhelmingly for them, I mean, it's great to play in that sandbox. I'm not sure you're going to win the game. And I'm just being candid and honest.
The next question is, how much of the geographic polarization is due to gerrymandering? In other words, does any of that polarization that you showed change because we didn't draw the districts well, or somebody drew them so that they would be very gerrymandered.
Yeah. As noted, I've written a book about gerrymandering in North Carolina. It had struck me moving from South Carolina to North Carolina. I knew a little bit about redistricting dynamics at play in this state. Just to give you a sense of things, since the 1980s and particularly since the 1990s, North Carolina has never had a complete set of maps. U.S. House, North Carolina State House, North Carolina State Senate. We have never had all three of those maps survive a decade of redistricting. There has always been changes occurring, either for racial dynamics or partisan dynamics. Now, as a social scientist, my training is to look at the data, to look at the evidence, and to make the analysis based on that. I say in terms of gerrymandering, the fault, dear Brutus, may lie with the lines, but more importantly, the fault lies with the voters, because the voters have sorted themselves into these precincts. The voters have chosen to live in precincts that overwhelmingly go for one party over the other. And when it comes to redistricting, all you are doing is drawing lines around these precincts and packing them into a district and creating it based out of those building blocks of the precincts. And if the precincts are behaving in a certain manner and you combine them, is it any surprise that those districts play at the same tune as those precincts? And so, yes, gerrymandering, the redistricting, the redrawing of lines can aggravate the dynamics. But in terms of trying to get to competitive precincts and competitive districts, you're oftentimes packing into precincts that overwhelmingly vote for this party and precincts that overwhelmingly vote for that party, and then you create the competitive districts. Our current map is a 7-7 split. We see that it can be done. But as I tell students, elections matter. The elections that matter most end in the year 0. Because if you are the winner of the General Assembly in the year that ends in 0, you get the power to redistrict. And every political party will do so to buy an insurance policy for their future. And with the consistency of voter patterns and the consistent political dynamics at play, these districts probably will hold for several years until the next cycle. And then we take into account the population changes and we go over it again. So redrawing of lines matters, but where people live and the sorting that has occurred is a critical component in the equation of getting these districts.
Thank you. Could you tell us a little more about your definition of urban suburbs?
Yes.
That was a very different thing, so we'd like to have a little more information on that.
Certainly, and that's a great question. It is something that I came to kind of an aha moment a couple of years ago and have really been tracking it over time. So you take Wake County, Mecklenburg County, Forsyth County, Guilford, Buncombe, Cumberland, any area that's got a major metropolitan city in it. And you take that central city, but go outside the city limits. So Wake has, of course, Raleigh, but there are areas outside of Raleigh's central city limits that are a part of Wake County. That's what I would call the classic suburbs. Oftentimes in the past, we have used those areas as the suburbs, And then if you bounce across a county line, those were your exurbs. Those were the outside suburban areas. Well, there's been so much economic and cultural and transportation integration. If you look at Mecklenburg County and Charlotte, you've got Gaston, Iredale, Cabarrus, Union counties. They're all feeding into Mecklenburg, and then at the end of the day, feeding out. If you have ever been on I-85 moving from Charlotte to Gastonia or even beyond to Kings Mountain, you know exactly what I'm talking about, because it is a complete nightmare of traffic jams. But that integration between those surrounding suburban counties and the central cities, there's a boundary in between those two. And that's what those urban suburbs are. I hope that helps clarify. Yeah.
I think it does. Thank you. Have you looked at gender differences in the young voters? This questioner has said, I have heard that young men and young women are voting very differently.
I have heard that too, and have started to see some evidence of that. I've not been able to kind of dissect that out, but I think I can do that in looking at the percentages within a precinct of millennial women, millennial men, now Gen Z women, Gen Z men. I think, one of the big issues is certainly the Dobbs decision that was handed down. And for a lot of political analysts and political scientists, when it came to the 2022 elections, we were not sure what was going to be the impact of that decision. It had a clear impact. And I think you're seeing it also continue to play in this year's cycle. And I think you will see it as a major campaign theme, in particularly for the Biden campaign, especially. And, one thing that I'm really going to be focused on is, and I can break these numbers down, I just haven't had the time to do so, the party identification. We would tend to think younger men tend to be more Republican, younger women tend to be more Democratic. I think that's the national pattern that we're seeing, but especially among younger voters, and particularly this new generation, Gen Z, coming into the electorate, how much of a difference is there? Is there a fairly stark difference between those two? And I don't have a complete answer for you right now, but that is certainly something I think we as analysts and political scientists need to be looking at closely moving forward. You're giving me a lot of great ideas. So
the next question comes from it's the graph on the generational balance. Does that show that Republicans vote more consistently than Democrats?
I think that there is something to that, simply because when you look also at generational turnout levels, it's not quite apples to apples. But one aspect that I have looked into and have seen the patterns is that registered Republicans tend to have the highest turnout rates. Now, this combines all the generations, and I need to break them out probably by generational cohorts. But registered Republicans tend to have an above statewide turnout rate. Registered Democrats tend to meet the state turnout rate. Registered unaffiliateds, that are the largest block of voters, have the lowest turnout rate. So I think that there is something there. The consistency, the loyalty is probably stronger among Republicans. But I think with the parties having sorted themselves, and if you are registering as a partisan, you are most likely identifying as a true partisan. That kind of party loyalty, we need to figure out a little bit better and tap into, but that's kind of my early hypothesis. I think you're onto it, that certainly registered Republicans would have the highest consistent loyalty to their tickets. But I need to do some further analysis on that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do your classes change significantly during an election such as 2024? That's a really good question.
Well, we haven't survived to November, so I can only give you a month's worth of data in that regard. Boy, that's a great question. Here's what I have noticed, particularly among young people who are either majoring in politics, which is our major at Catawba, or they're majoring in the administration of justice, which is our criminal justice program. I teach more politics folks, but I get the ADJU folks in several of my classes. What I have found is that young people, first and foremost, are the children of polarized politics. They have known nothing other than the two parties doing this continuously. And that, for the most part, has turned them off. I think that helps to explain that rise of the unaffiliated voter. What I have found, though, is that for folks who are majoring in politics or ADJU, they have, and this has been consistent over a number of years, they have an intense interest in public service. They want to serve the public, whether it's going into law enforcement, whether it's going to work for a government agency, whether it's going to law school and advocating for groups. I have been struck and consistently impressed with the idea of, I want to serve the public. And I think even in this polarized environment, if we are getting people willing to go in and do the hard work that government service is, I sleep a little bit better at night knowing that. And I think when it comes to elections, I can only refer back to 2020's presidential election. And the students, we were watching it unfold in real time, and something would happen and we would come in. It's very hard to write lectures for that kind of a class because you don't know what has happened the 24 hours or 48 hours prior, since we last met to when we meet again. And I distinctly remember we were coming up on the first presidential debate, and we went through a rubric, and I said, all right, I want everybody to grade the candidates. We want, how did they stay on message? What was their theme? What was the tones, et cetera, et cetera. And then we had that first, I'm not even going to call it a presidential debate. It was a mud fight of epic proportions. And I had to walk and we had class the next day, that next morning. And I literally walked into class and said, folks, I need to apologize to you. You did not experience a presidential debate. You experienced wrestling with pigs in that debate. And that was not a debate. And surprisingly, they were not surprised. They were not stunned by it. They thought that's how presidential debates went. And I kind of had to show them some clips from previous presidential debates that helped to give them a sense of, okay, this is not normal for us in that regard. So when it comes to elections, I have students on both sides of the political aisle. I tell them the number one rule of my classes are, you can express your opinion. I would hope you would back it up with facts and data. The golden rule number 2 is, you have to listen to the other side and understand where they are coming from if you want to share your perspective. And we have built a very deliberative, yes, we have tension-filled classes sometimes because some of these folks are very passionate about issues. But I always have to remind them, you need to hear from the other side because maybe you haven't thought about an issue from that perspective, and maybe that might inform your perspective. It may not change your perspective, but maybe it better informs how you look at things.
Thank you. Terry, are you going to step in now?
We have time for maybe just a couple more questions. I don't want us to run
Oh,
over.
yeah, 12 o'clock.
One of them is there any historical precedent for a particular issue arising that overcomes the normal party affiliations during any particular election? And this questioner is thinking about, say, abortion and the post-Roe landscape.
That's a great question. When I was in graduate school in the late 90s, early 2000s, and took a class on voting behavior, the big emphasis was economics tends to drive voter decision making. That pocketbook issues and the national economy tend to be the preeminent issue and the driver of how voters tend to make their choices. And when it comes to things like presidential vote choices, are we going to reward the incumbent if the economy is good? Or are we going to punish the incumbent if the economy is bad? Well, in that 20-year time period, political scientists have now come to the realization that it's not so much policy issues per se, that it is indeed party identification that is the single best variable factor that helps to explain voter behavior. And so I think party identification, the partisanship, and it's not just supporting your party, it's what we call negative partisanship or affective polarization. It's not so much I want to support my party and my candidate. It's I hate the other side and I can't wait to vote against them than necessarily vote for my party. And so we are in this polarization dynamic that has basically made us negative partisans to the point of we can statistically show that this kind of behavior now overrides all other issues for the majority of most voters. But yes, some policy issues matter more to some voters. The economy will always be at the top. I think abortion will continue to be at the front of the issues. Foreign policy usually tends to be low on the totem pole. Maybe it creeps up this year. Heck, we got 9 more months to go before the November election. You tell me what the issues are in October, I could probably tell you what the stock market's doing with that assurity. And I can't tell you what the stock market's going to be doing in October.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, one last question, and then we'll let you go.
Okay.
What do you think the effect of ranked choice voting would be in this state?
Ooh. North Carolina has experimented with ranked choice voting, particularly in judicial elections. It did not get a favorable review from a lot of folks, so it has gone away. I think what ranked choice voting does is that it helps to overcome one of the rules of American politics, and that is the first past the post phenomenon. That most people think you need a majority of the votes to win. No, you really don't. You need one more vote than the person that came in second, and that can be below 50%. And so if we use ranked choice voting, what that potentially does is give the voter the opportunity to first be sincere in their voting choice. I really like this third party, but they ain't got a chance to win. But I can cast my first vote for my true belief. And then my second vote goes to, okay, it's going to be this guy or this gal. I'm going to vote for this lady. as my second choice because I hate the third choice or whatever it is. I think that that gives some flexibility and some ability to express a sincere vote along with a strategic vote. But you got to overcome the 200 plus years of first past the post dynamics to kind of really make that soak in. It is very unique compared to what we see in places like European countries that have that. So,
Man. Dr. Bitzer, you have given us a lot to think about and a lot to talk about, and we appreciate you taking the time to do this. As Jimmy, our co-president, says, she feels like she's been in a college class today. It's fantastic. So I do want to follow this up by letting everybody know we're going to be doing a training with Lillian's List on March 9th. Sign up for that, and we will use everything that we have learned here today, and we will hash it out and try to sort this out so that we can work it to our advantage. So, all right. Michael Bitzer, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate everything that you've told us. So,
my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. Hope everybody has a good rest of the weekend.
all right, you too. Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone, and we will reconvene soon.